inviting me, and thank you for coming. I know how difficult it is to show up to these things and get people to show up to them on Monday afternoons at any point in the term, but particularly now it starts to become crunching time. So thank you very much for that. The talk that I'm going to give today is not a polished paper. I thought that's probably not very useful for me or for you. So this is something that's in progress. Some of the work that I'm talking about is starting to be published, but some is probably at the beginning of what I would see as at least a 2-year cycle in terms of getting into these things. So I'm definitely looking for feedback, questions, what have you, in terms of how I'm going to, the issues that I'll raise that I'm still sort of grappling with in terms of how I'm going to deal with them. I have a bit of an introduction, I think, to sort of contextualize myself in terms of how I'm situated within this discussion and literature, and probably many of the people you've already heard in this series and will hear from. And then I'll get into the slides and some of the specific discussion about the Sonoran Desert and this crazy thing called Avatar that they have developed there. We wait in the parking lot of a gas station for our handler to arrive. It's shortly after 9 a.m. and we can see the border fence running up a hillside, while a U.S. Border Patrol SUV makes its way up the winding fence line, periodically stopping and dismounting from the vehicle. We are in Nogales, Arizona, a town separated in half by the U.S.-Mexico border. Here, sovereign power is far less imaginary, as the town's geography is itself scarred by the massive border fence that runs through it. We head back down the block to the border crossing into Nogales, Sonora, a town known for its cheap and easy prescription drugs and inexpensive dental care, industries that are in dramatic decline due to the intensified border security. Because our plans for the day include a visit to a maquiladora, we require a work visa simply for a visit. After some confusion, awkward situations involving loosely guarded weapons and a very clean bathroom, and I'll tell the story about that later, we are told to purchase stamps at a bank counter that is conveniently located nearby. The queue is already building in the late morning for the foot traffic to cross the border. Nogales is a relatively quiet town, unlike it has been in the past, and our guide tells us that particularly since increased restrictions, the local economy is in dramatic decline. Many of the pharmacies with their advertising for Cialis and Viagra are boarded shut. It is the border crossing where the newly developed artificial intelligence kiosk Avatar, which I will speak of later, is currently being field tested. This odd techno-space, in what we might call a topography of border control, or what I am referring to as somatechnical Sonora, is a sign of the times, and a sign of what some are calling Borderworld, connoting the manner in which the US-Mexico borderland and indeed many international borderscapes are becoming states unto themselves, governed by logics of control society, social sorting, and intensification of the somatechnical. Studies of the border and borderlands have gone through a vast array of methodological, theoretical, and analytical changes over the past decade, something I certainly don't have to tell this audience. As William Walters rightly points out in his article Border Control, in the aftermath of the revolutions throughout Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 and the subsequent decade of interventions and decolonizations, many observers vociferously spoke of the decline of borders, their atrophy, even the emergence of an alleged borderless world. And at the same time, anthropologists, geographers, and many others began to intensify their focus on the border. These analyses were found across the disciplines, in the likes of Kenichi Ome and even Susan Strange in political economy, comparative politics, IR scholars, the Orientalist visions of the clash of civilizations, and even Barbara's Jihad versus McWorld, and Kaplan's Revenge of Geography, which is already facing the revenge of critical geographers. All of which bound up perhaps the best or the worst way in Tom Friedman's Flat World thesis were basically a vision of a world where borders no longer mattered. These wide-ranging theses covered the fields of geography, historiography, politics, economics, even sociology and anthropology. However, even more socially responsible and responsive analysis began to seriously question these discussions and the way in which something counter to the Hobbesian vision that we had become familiar with was in fact withering away. Many of those speaking of the atrophy of borders were often found within international political economy, which came to dominate discourses of globalization. Again, something that I don't need to talk about here. As Walter notes, arguments such as Hart and Negri's empire raise serious questions to these sometimes politically naive neoliberal accounts of global politics, where borders are simply problems for the flourishing growth of global capitalism. Hart and Negri's intellectual and philosophically rich and challenging account of contemporary global socioeconomics and politics draws our attention to biopolitical dimensions of contemporary state power and the manner in which the logic of empire moves to rearticulate and reimagine the contemporary topography of border control. The necessity of strong borders to thwart unwanted migration, irregular unless we want it, and risky, whatever that might be defined at that particular point in time, and so on, has compelled not simply a series of rebordering practices, but a reinvigoration of sovereign power, the sort that was often only experienced in the precise geographies of the border. Particularly in the new topography of border control, or the somatechnical border, the interests of consumerism control society, surveillance imperatives of social sorting, and the manner in which all of this is oddly bound up within the manifestation of capital itself, seen most evidently in something like the development of Avatar or the drone program in North Dakota, is rather telling. It is the emergence of the complex matrix of interests, authorities, and violent geographies that many have prompted scholarly inquiry into what is called rebordering. And again, those involved in the mobility turn and so on are familiar with that. My own research, particularly in this case, is found at this precise location, this complex web of the disciplines, debates, and border fantasies. By recounting the story of the emerging reliance on biometric and surveillance technologies in the borderlands of the Sonoran Desert between Arizona and Sonora, with some comparative elements raised by the controversial spring law of SB 1070. And here I'll just mention SB 1070, for those who don't know, is a Senate bill created in Arizona in April of 2010. The title of it is to support our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act. So it has these nice euphemistic titles, things like the Patriot Act. Basically, already existing federal law requires anyone over the age of 14 who remains for more than 30 days to produce some sort of documentation. What this act does is make that a specific misdemeanor within Arizona and therefore enforceable by state police as opposed to federal jurisdiction. Effectively asking for papers by the police, and that asking predominantly on the basis of racial profiling. Almost codifying that in law specifically. And this has come up to the Supreme Court a couple of times, and that specific aspect has not yet been put down. A couple of other portions of the law have been. I think it's important to raise that in the context of this, 1 month later, House Bill 2281 was released, which challenges the ability to teach ethnic studies within local schools in Arizona in the public school system. Basically trying to remove Mexican American studies from the curriculum altogether. I argue that these logics that clearly move far away from the border are in fact a part of that border world, wherein a vast array of techniques and technologies are similar across a variety of borderlands throughout the world. In this case, more than 20 states have attempted to pursue something along the lines of SB 1070, and certainly there's a variety of nations throughout the world where we can look at similar examples. This can all help us to rearticulate as a techno-space or a somatechnical space the Sonoran border. Just for those not familiar with Somatechnics, and I don't want this to be a whole talk on that, but I'll give you a little brief blurb on this. It's a relatively new concept coming from some Australian scholars, predominantly Susan Stryker, Joseph Pugliese, and Nikki Sullivan, and emphasizes the link between soma, which is the body, and the body as a culturally intelligible construct, and techne or technology, and the way in which that transforms the body. So it's something very different than, for example, talking about biometrics and the way in which it's simply added to the body, but in fact reconstitutes the body through the use of that technology. And Joseph Pugliese's book on that is exceptional. The body is always and already inscribed within the system of technological mediations, and therefore a complex politics is deployed when claims of visibility and invisibility are made, which become particularly important in this context. A lot of simply the discourse has to do with visibility and invisibility, whether we're talking about the teaching of ethnic studies or whether we go into those crossing by foot the border in night and so on, and sort of more less metaphoric decisions. So getting into my kind of research and the slideshow here then, the core issues that I'm considering, basically looking at the Sonoran Borderland and a variety of issues, if you will, that there's a confluence of in this space. The first is the development of Avatar itself, which is a technology I'll talk about in a moment. I have some slide that has some pictures of it. This technology is actually developed predominantly in the Sonoran Borderland. So it is developed at the University of Arizona to then manage that specific borderland. One of the chief employers in this region happens to be Raytheon Technologies and some other military contractors. So you have individuals who historically have crossed this border regularly, have all sorts of family ties and so on, who are also then involved in a political economy that is producing a radically different management of that border. And so to an extent, it's trying to unpack that, what the implication and application of the reliance on an artificial intelligence kiosk. So, I mean, Avatar takes, it's sort of like the high point, if you will, of technology at the border in that sense. It's removing the border guard altogether. It's not simply providing some biometric technologies for the border guard to use, but it's something that's taking that individual out of the loop. How is the borderland and the mobile bodies that inhabit it transformed, reconceptualized, or rearticulated by the development of these technologies within that border space itself? And the notions of visibility and invisibility, the way in which the technology, for example, is framed as something almost anti or in sharp contrast to the individuals who cross the border, who are framed as non-technological, and that will in fact potentially create some sort of problem, at least in terms of the discourse of the developers themselves. Just in terms of this image here, this is on the University of Arizona campus. It's by two artists who have done a lot of work along the Canada-US border, Guadalupe Serrano and Alberto Moraquez. That piece of steel that is depicting the border here is actually used in the Vietnam War and the First Gulf War. They would use a number of these pieces of steel to form landing strips for aircraft. So that's the steel that's used, and then basically the idea is that the border is on the campus. That's sort of how everyone talks about it. So I thought it was a fitting image to start with. Since I know there's geographers here, I'm like scared to talk about this because there's like maps now, and so now everything I say will be probably silly and strange. First of all, to give you a sense in terms of that borderland, in your lower right-hand map there, you see Tucson and the kind of proximity to the border. And that space, Green Valley, which you should be able to see if you follow straight down from Tucson, that's an important transit area, as are the mountain ranges there for a lot of the migrants who walk across the border going through. So it's, and I've got a picture of one of the mountain ranges. It's definitely sometimes not what we might think when we kind of imagine the desert. So it's very cold in a lot of these areas and extremely treacherous, and not simply, sort of Hollywood vision of what the desert looks like. And Nogales as a city is in fact cut in half. There is a sort of border town portion of it to an extent that has a microeconomy that historically has had a lot to do with the cross-border travel. And then on the Mexican side, there's sort of a larger, we might call suburb, that's evolved for a little bit further from the border in that case. But this is the test site for Avatar, so it's one of the reasons I've tended to focus there, because they've actually, the only field testing that's been done in the United States is in this site. Their other field testing has been in Europe with Frontex, the institution that's responsible for internal border management in the European Union. One of the reasons is probably because Frontex has no budget, so they will accept anything to be tested. And so they were willing to do this. Some have also said, and this is obviously not publicly stated by its developers, that they couldn't test it in this area at the time that it was developed because it was sort of ready to go around the time of SB 1070 and all this legislation. So suddenly rolling out this scary piece of technology at that precise moment on the border may have been too politically contentious, so they shipped it off to the Polish border. So this is the town itself. This is the border wall that's going through it, or fence, or that is, of course, one of the flaws in it, as many there pointed out, that you can pass things through the fence. Obviously you could also throw them over, but that's a little more obvious, but passing through is quite easy. But it's very clearly cut in half completely, and there's a lot of migration that occurs here daily for all sorts of reasons that we would be familiar with in terms of shopping and so on. Tucson very much focuses, like I think the sort of border towns that Canadians would be familiar with. We go there to find big shopping malls and shop, and that's the same sort of mobility that goes on in this space to a great extent. There are, of course, also a whole series of other crisscrossing identities here. It's important to remember the kind of history here, and that's the next slide here. I think the San Javier mission is definitely a kind of site that helps to represent a lot of the crisscrossing aspects of this borderland. This was built in the 1700s as part of Spanish colonialism, which is obviously a significant part of the region. And the labor to build this was used from the local Tohono O'odham people, the First Nations in that area. And there are many people who will trace their identities in some ways to the Tohono O'odham or the Yaqui within that area, as well as on either sides of the border. So there's, it sort of fits that almost caricature, if you will, of Borderlands, where there's these very, very elaborate webs of identity that exist. And I think this sort of site is certainly one where historically it's evolved as a representation of that, and also continues to be a place where those different identities come to meet. So it is currently actually on the native reservation for the Tohono O'odham people, and so it also has that odd sort of situatedness there. The other point to raise, of course, is until 1854 this was Mexico. So that's something else why maybe it would make us less surprised to hear why any form of ethnic studies, Mexican-American studies, might want to be removed from schools, because then it might remind people how synthetic the sort of border is here and how new it is in that sense. This is the mountain range, the Huachaca mountain range, which is 9,400 feet, part of the Sierra. So this is predominantly where a lot of migration has occurred in response to the sort of crackdown, if you will, at the border. So as I think any of those of you who have looked at the U.S. border and the introduction of all sorts of walls and barriers and so on, that clearly what this does is often alter the flows. It doesn't stop them. And a lot of research done around the Tijuana area has done a good job of demonstrating that, and it's similar here. And it's changed the kind of local politics. So a lot of the towns that are located in these regions, some of them have historically been quite on the conservative right, and interestingly that started to change as a result of their more frequent interactions with migrants. So I mean, at some points definitely there was kind of resistance, but as more and more people, get their paper in the morning and find someone sleeping on their doorstep, it seems that there has been a corresponding change within the politics to start to move to ask more critical questions, if you will, of the border security. This is another very important aspect of this borderland in trying to understand what's going on there is the military-industrial complex. The second largest U.S. Air Force installation is there. So you don't walk around very much on a sunny day without seeing some sort of military hardware flying over your head. The Raytheon Technologies develops and produces the Sidewinder missiles in this area as well, and it's one of the largest employers, and that actually there's a corresponding relationship to a very, very large influx of Hispanic students with an engineering program at the University of Arizona, because there's a sort of promise this is where employment will be provided in the development of these technologies. And obviously Avatar kind of gets into that. Again, historically, there's also a nuclear missile site in this area as well, so there's a history of the military-industrial complex. I've sort of split this up in terms of like what I call human or inhuman in the idea of the somatechnical. The picture on the left there, we went to a reception center. I think it's a good example of the kind of human aspects of this border. So because this is a border town, it's also a place where the United States will repatriate those that are captured. At various sites along the border, the United States does not feel compelled to repatriate individuals anywhere near where they're found. So for example, someone may have been near Tijuana, a migrant found in that region, and is picked up and then released here, which is a significant distance. And so these centers play a role in both, in many cases, trying to give people nourishment, because according to their stories, they're generally not provided with sufficient food in the detention facilities, and to try to reconnect people in some way. So I mean, one of the reasons there's a whole series of reasons, and feel free to ask about it, but one of the reasons in terms of just kind of what might almost sound cold, callous research, but this is clearly low tech. This is like individual people volunteering. Interestingly, large numbers of volunteers coming from the Green Valley area, where in fact migrants often end up, coming then to this reception center, which is in Mexico, to volunteer their time to help the migrants sort of find families and reconnect and so on. So that's a sort of not nice story of the U.S.-Mexico border. The bizarre story that's allegedly really nice is the one on the right, where we were at a maquiladora, and this was an Alcatrel maquila, so it's high-tech industry. So any films you've seen about maquilas and the way in which they're all horrific, we got taken to the one that counters all of that. This did look like some sort of utopia where people were sitting around, not even working very hard. Everyone was saying how wonderful it was. They in fact have their own kind of soccer teams and all sorts of cultural things, which were very bizarre. And so it was represented as, well, sure, the border has, damaged those parts of the economy, but those aren't really like significant parts of the economy, people using dentistry and so on. This is flourishing, look how wonderful this is. And we need strong borders for this to happen, because this manages the kind of flows we need. We don't want flows of people going here, there, and everywhere, but we do want, capital and goods and so on flowing in very controlled manners. And that's working great, so isn't it wonderful? Then we have the inhuman, and this is Avatar. So Avatar stands for Automated Virtual Agent for Truth Assessments in Real Time. So just to give you a sense of how this works and is demonstrated and so on, first of all, it travels around in what looks like a casket, so there is a sort of embodiment to it, and they sort of raise it out like a person. And then it needs to warm up, I guess, like a person would if they came out of a casket. And then the sort of head guy who's had contracts from NASA and everything else, he does his spiel about this, how it's the high point of technology and so on. And by then it's warmed up, and this face appears on the screen, and it's sort of in its I don't know, sleep mode is not the right thing to say because its eyes were open, but it's blinking and just sort of looking around. Now I'm not sure if it's looking around for real, but that's what it appears to be doing. Now there are a whole series of sensors on this machine, so that black bar that you see under the screen has a series of sensors. There is something you actually put your fingers into for biometrics, and there's another camera above as well. So it's taking apparently 15 different readings of you, which interestingly, and this is something again I'm happy to discuss more afterwards, by their own measurement and their own literature, in terms of the number of personal cues that we would potentially have, is an insufficient percentage to make any rational decision on. That's in their own literature. But irrespective of that, they are field testing this, and it is marketed not as something that will save money. It is distinctly marketed as something that is there for deception detection. The idea being, and the way in which they talk about this, the problem at the border is that humans can be deceived, and this machine will not be deceived. And so at the moment, its actual field testing is in the Mexico-US equivalent to the Nexus program, which is called Sentry. Again, the euphemisms are great. And this is doing those interviews. So there's, I think, 5 machines, and one individual kind of manages machines. But how this works, you walk up to it, it's just like a border guard. It says, good afternoon. Why are you traveling today? Why are you crossing the border? Did you pack your bags yourself? All the usual questions we would expect in that very short period of time that we have an interaction. And then it will make the decision whether or not you require secondary inspection. So it will say, all right, have a nice day, or I feel you are deceiving me, and so you need to go and see someone else. So, yes. It says I'm not, it said something, I'm not happy with your answers. I'm not satisfied with your answers. Can you please see the other agent? And so...
is this the machine next to it? Or?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think in their minds, yes. Yeah.
Please go see the Mark II.
Yes. So
the black, what was the black bar, did you say?
There's some cameras in there. There's also something that senses body temperature as well.
Okay.
So, this demonstration occurred happily. This was, I guess, my 3rd time going down there, and with me kind of actually not badgering my colleague there. He decided he should badger them because he works at the university where a lot of the money is going towards this. He said, can we have a demonstration and a discussion with social scientists present and have a talk? And they thought, sure, this will be great. So they did the whole thing, and then we started asking our questions. So, someone said, what if someone's hostile to technology? What if you see this and I hate these stupid machines? And you start getting angry. Is that accounted for? Well, no, because everybody likes technology, don't be silly. Clearly people who develop these like technology, so that was never thought of. Then the question was asked, to what extent was the fact that certain gender and racial characters, basically kind of a particular frame is basically bred into the technologies. Ultimately, that the genealogies of things such as biometrics, even fingerprinting, have demonstrated that the white male is the kind of one that's used as the model. And, the testing of facial recognition technologies, for example, at Miami-Dade Airport a few years ago, which did not work on African Americans, bore that out. That's something that can happen. So we were asked to repeat the question 3 different ways, because it was not computing. And then finally the developer said, oh, well, the face on that screen can be any gender or race you want. We can change that to whatever we like. But we have found that it's better if it reflects the individual more closely. So if a male goes up, it needs to be a male face. So they completely didn't get the question at all, which again was frightening given the millions of dollars that they're using and now field testing it. So, happy to talk about that more, but for me in my research, there's 2. One is the impact of this on the border and its actual use. How does one interact with this? How is one viewed? There's a great quote that I have to read here from a researcher who's involved, one of the head researchers involved in this project, he said, we need to see how it responds to the kind of dirty, grimy environment, the uncontrolled space where people who aren't familiar with technology reside. So this was his comment on its field testing in Nogales. So, you know, almost something akin to the sort of new Colossus statement, right? That you need to, the great unwashed will now encounter technology, and how will they react to it, and how will it function? So it's interesting that the developers are speaking that discourse. So part of my research is to look at actually the field testing itself and see what's going on. What are the, again, when those assumptions built into that technology actually get used. The other is its actual development and the way in which many of the developers happen to also be people who cross the border very regularly, who have all sorts of identity and family ties and so on across the border. How does that function? Is that problematic? Is it interesting? Is it completely irrelevant? I'm not sure. The other point is drones here, and drones are also developed at the Raytheon technologies in that area and increasingly used along that border. So it's another example of a technology developed in the borderland for the kind of securitization of the border itself through technology, where these aren't kind of things brought in from elsewhere. They're definitely developed within that space itself. Another dimension now in terms of the borderland is this tent. This is the interstate highway that goes from Tucson to Nogales, and this is about almost 100 miles inland from the border, and it is a border crossing. It's a complete border crossing. In fact, they have now installed, this photo's a little bit old, they've now installed these sorts of cameras that you have at any border we'd be familiar with that take picture of your license plates and so on. This is a complete border crossing, but it's 100 miles inland. So the way in which this sort of, as Nick Von Williams says, the border's not where it's supposed to be, this is another interesting dynamic. First of all, whether that technology for my own interest gets used there and so on, and what all that means. The interesting point is this has actually sparked a lot of local resistance, because if there's one thing that Americans often tend to be, it's hostile towards their government. And they're very hostile towards this, that this is unconstitutional and so on, and that it's clearly not, quote unquote, temporary. Which is the actual discourse surrounding it. That's why it's allowable, because it's temporary. And so it's dealing with the fact that this tends to be the region where migrants tend to then collect again, so we can have this secondary check. When we crossed it, we were in a van, and I produced my passport very rapidly, and it went to the front of the van, and the guard just grabbed it and said, "Oh, you're all Canadians, that's fine." And we weren't, but he just said that's fine, and off we went. Didn't check anyone else's, so I pulled the Canadian card again and got us through. But in terms, again, I mean, there's a lot of discourse and discussion within the border literature about the border expanding outwards, becoming thick, the proliferation of borders, and a lot of it has to do with sort of metaphorical things or technological things, where, you know, we book an airline ticket on Expedia, and there's ways in which the border is then actually, we're crossing the border in a variety of ways. Here we actually, this is visceral. You're physically again crossing a border. You're encountering border guards. You're suddenly in that tent, again captured within the discretionary power of the state in the way that you are in border spaces, and in a way that, at least in sort of our Western liberal democracies, we tend to assume we are not when we're not in those particular spaces. So I think it speaks to something there as well. So in terms of the research that I've done, what I've done is looking in this specific region a bit, and certainly more broadly within U.S. borders, at the politics of biometric technology and border control, and more recently, what sort of role that this technology plays in the Sonoran Desert with the global criminalization of borders, the way in which mobility is increasingly being something that's criminalized. What I plan to do, and what I'm interested in here, is trying to unpack some of these issues in terms of the political economy of the borderland that is so bound up within the development of the technologies that are then being applied to that border in these very specific ways that obviously has dramatic impacts on those crossing the border, but they're the same individuals in this case, the people crossing and the people involved in that political economy. They're all bound up in that. One way in, I think, is maybe something like the human terrain approach that Jim Derderian does. The other aspect of this research, and this really comes out of the meetings with the developers of Avatar, is the way in which perhaps, and this is just sort of the language that a few of us are using now, is this idea of the fiduciary obligation of interdisciplinary research. The way in which social scientists tend to be held to a certain standard of having to know something about the technology, let's say, or the specific quote-unquote realities of the policy field that we talk about. But in the case of the scientific development of these technologies, there's actually nothing that appears to compel these developers to have to consider in any remotely serious way the kind of ethical, political, social ramifications of the technologies. So, very simple analyses about the genealogies of something like fingerprinting and biometrics, that doesn't have to come into the discussion at all, that one can in fact use tens of millions of dollars, develop a technology, and that never needs to be part of the discussion. How to engage it, obviously that's a complex and potentially problematic process, because the individuals with the money and doing those projects probably don't want to hear that. But that's certainly something else in terms of where I and others are going to. And I just sort of give a little plug because I'm always hosted there by this Confluence Center that is at the University of Arizona, and they're always very generous and helpful and very interesting people there doing great work. So that's all I have for you, and I look forward to your questions.